The Courage of the Truth, lectures by Michel Foucault at the College of France, 1983-84. Lecture number 6, first hour, given on 7th of March, 1984. This week, I have received a letter from an auditor concerning parousia and the different and new meanings of the word in Christian literature. She has sent me some very interesting references in Cassian, John Climacus, the sayings, the church fathers, etc. Then, self-effacement, she does not put her name or address, so I cannot reply. Anyway, I say to her that she is in fact quite right. Her references are interesting. That is precisely the direction I would like to take this year, if I have the time, to show you how, through the evolution of the term parousia in Greco-Roman antiquity, we arrive with Christianity at a sort of breaking up of the meanings of the word parousia in Christian literature. Certainly, when Gregory of Nazianzus praises Maximus, presenting him as a cynic endowed with parousia, the word is employed with its completely traditional meaning. But a whole set of other meanings will be brought to the word parousia. This is what I would like to study a bit later. This is the brief answer to this letter, simply in the form of a promise, which I am not even sure I will be able to keep. Second, still with regard to cynicism, I have finally found a book. I don't mean the book, but a book on cynicism, which is certainly much more interesting, much more documented anyway, than those I referred to last week. It is again a German book, since clearly the historical and philosophical problem of cynicism has preoccupied the Germans a great deal, at least since the end of the Second World War. It can be found in the Bibliothèque Nationale, was written by someone called Heinrich Niehu Probsting, and is entitled Der Kynismus des Diogen und der Begriff des Zynismus. You see the two spellings of the word cynicism: kynismus, ancient cynicism, and Zionismus, the general notion of cynicism. The book was published in 1979, and I recommend it to you. There is both a very interesting analysis of ancient cynicism and a history of the concept of cynicism, which is very different, moreover, in its references from the very vague sketch I gave you last week when I tried to locate at least some of the vehicles of cynicism, of the cynic life, the cynic attitude in Western culture, within Christian institutions, political life, and artistic practice. In Probsting's book, you will find instead a whole series of references to theoretical reflection on cynicism, to the way in which it has been represented in the history of philosophy from the 16th century to the present, and to authors who have referred more or less directly to cynicism, sometimes quite explicitly, like Wieland, Friedrich Schlegel, but also others like Nietzsche. The author gives some good indications on how Nietzsche cynicism was perceived, considered, and criticized in his own time, or immediately afterwards, in particular by someone called Ludwig Stein, who in 1893 wrote a book about Nietzsche's Weltanschauung and its dangers, and in which he identifies, picks out, and denounces Nietzsche's cynicism. You will find all this in the book. I have not read it all, and I cannot swear to you that there is nothing about Rameau's Nephew, which is nevertheless a moment, a turning point in the history of reflection on cynicism in the West. And nor is there anything on Sade. So there you are. For anyone interested in cynicism, I add, and for this forgive my error, of course, that I have not spoken about Glucksmann's book, Cynisma a Passion, which is indeed a reflection on the possible meanings and values of cynicism in the present. So let us return humbly and modestly to the history of cynicism in antiquity, to which I would like to devote this session. If I do not have time to finish, we will continue next week. But I would like to try to finish now. I will begin by indicating some problems concerning cynicism, which both single it out from other forms of philosophical reflection and practice in antiquity, and make it difficult to analyze. To say some very basic, very schematic things, the first difficulty and singularity concerning cynicism is the variety of attitudes and conducts which were picked out and recognized in the same period as falling under cynicism. Of course, there's always a central core, or at least a sort of stereotype, which is regularly stamped as cynicism in everyone's eyes. The blazon of cynicism is, we have already spoken about this, the man in the short cloak, with the long beard, bare and dirty feet, begging pouch, and staff, who is found on the street corner, in the public square, and at the temple door, questioning people and telling them some home truths. But beyond or beside this stereotype, on both sides of this familial character, who is reported already in the 4th century BCE and is found again facing Julian in the 3rd century CE. There are many other forms of life which put themselves forward at the time and were perceived, described, vaunted, and depreciated as cynic forms of life. I will take 2 extreme examples, or at any rate, extremely different examples. There's the famous character Demetrius, who was very important in the history of cynicism and in the relations between cynic thought and life and Stoic thought, and very important for Seneca in particular. Seneca often quotes him, always with enormous praise, calling him our Demetrius, and saying that he is without doubt one of the most remarkable figures of the philosophy of his time, if not of all time. As we see him in Seneca's texts, Demetrius is clearly someone who certainly leads a simple, poor life, since in one of his letters, Seneca says that he prefers the company of Demetrius to that of those who wear purple. And he contrasts the Simonides, half-naked Demetrius, with those who wear purple. Seneca recounts in On Benefits, Book 7, how this same Demetrius flatly and vigorously refused a significant sum of money which the Emperor Caligula had offered him. Demetrius is supposed to have accompanied his refusal with a commentary, sounding just like a cynic. He said, if he wanted to tempt me, he should have offered me the whole empire. Of course, he did not mean by this that if he had been offered the whole empire, he would have accepted and succumbed to temptation. But given that temptation is a test of one's resilience, by which one strengthens oneself and assures one's own sovereignty before the world, if he had needed a truly serious test by which he could have perfected himself, strengthened himself, and increased his resilience, then what was needed was obviously not the offer of a sum of money. It was at least the offer of the whole empire. That was the offer he would have had to resist, and which would have given his victory value and meaning. With this semi-nudist individual who refuses any offer one may make him, and who accompanies his refusal with firm, insolent words, referring to the stamp he gives to his whole life as a test. We have a character who is in fact completely cynic, corresponding to at least some of the fundamental features of cynic existence. But we should not forget that Seneca also portrays Demetrius as a man of culture, certainly far removed from all those street preachers to which the image of the cynic was often reduced. Again, in On Benefits, Book 7, Seneca speaks of his eloquence. He describes how Demetrius speaks and portrays him in this way. He is a man of perfect wisdom, whose eloquence is suited to important subjects, and who speaks without affectation, a studied use of words or ornate language. His eloquence pursues its object with great strength of mind, carried by its impulse, its impetus. This is a definition of sober, effective eloquence, of cynic eloquence, up to a point, inasmuch as it is stripped of all embellishment. But it is clear that the form of eloquence Seneca is describing here has nothing to do with the shrieking, insolence, and insults hurled at the crowd by street preachers. Moreover, the life led by Demetrius had nothing to do with the life of the popular agitator. He was linked to the Roman aristocracy and was counselor to a whole group which included Thrasea Paetus and Helvidius Priscus. When Thrasea Paetus was condemned to death, or at any rate, forced by the emperor to kill himself, Demetrius was exiled at the same time, along with several members of this group, like Helvidius Priscus. He was able to return only when Vespasian took power in 69. Once again, he became part of an opposition group, which seems to have been organized particularly around those who rejected the principle of a hereditary empire. He was again in the group of Helvidius Priscus and was expelled once more with other philosophers in the years 71 to 75. We have here the typical model, not of a court philosopher, but of a philosopher counselor, a soul counselor, and a political counselor of aristocratic groups. Nothing to do with the street orator. At the other extreme, cynicism may be symbolized by someone like Peregrinus, who we spoke about last week. He is quite the opposite, an ostentatious vagabond who is no doubt linked to the anti-Roman popular movements of Alexandria, addressing his teachings at Rome to the idioti, those without culture or social and political status. He was expelled from Rome. If we are to believe Lucian, later he probably became a Christian. Before his death, we shall see how he died shortly. Peregrinus sent his testament, advice, and laws to different towns. He played, or wanted to play, Lucian says in his highly critical portrait, the role of prophet, leader of the Theas. The people thought him a pontiff, a legislator, and even a god. Doubtless, nothing symbolizes better the contrast between these two characters. Peregrinus, who wanders over the Mediterranean world and mixes with the different popular and religious movements, and Demetrius, well located in the Roman aristocracy, then their relation to death and suicide. We do not know how Demetrius dies, but we know through the account given by Tacitus that he was counselor to Thrasea Paetus at the latter's suicide. When Thrasea Paetus was forced to kill himself on the emperor's orders, Demetrius was the only person who had access to him. Thrasea Paetus shut himself away with him, and in the manner of Socrates, they discussed the immortality of the soul. It was typically Greco-Roman suicide in the great tradition of ancient culture, quite clearly philosophical, and at the same time fully in line with a practice which existed in Rome and in the Roman aristocracy at that time. On the other hand, there is the suicide of Peregrinus. For Peregrinus killed himself, but in a completely different way. He killed himself by having himself burned alive near Olympia, after having organized this suicide, if we are to believe Lucian, who, again, gives a highly critical portrait of Peregrinus, calling the people around him and turning his death into a sort of grand popular festival. So a family of very different attitudes is brought together in the characterization of cynicism, which covers an extremely wide spectrum with regard to social rules as well as to political life or religious traditions. Basically, cynicism presents quite different models of attitudes, and this makes it rather difficult to define what would be the or a cynic attitude par excellence. This is the first difficulty, the first source of confusion we encounter when we want to study cynicism. The second reason why this analysis is rather difficult, which is, if you like, more interesting for making headway in the study of what cynicism is and was, is the ambiguity of the attitude towards it, especially in the period of its greatest development. That is to say, from the 1st century BCE to the 3rd century CE, let's say to Julian. During this long period of 4 centuries, we find that the attitude towards cynicism is in fact characterized by 2 things. First, of course, there are a great many very vigorous denunciations. Whatever zeal ancient philosophers had for arguing with each other, whatever the severity with which certain philosophical schools, like the Epicureans, for example, were opposed, I do not think that any portraits of the philosopher reach the level of violence that we find in the portraits of cynicism. The cynic is reproached for his coarseness, ignorance, and lack of culture. Here is an example of this from the end of the 2nd century, the portrait of the cynic given by Lucian, who was, of course, a great adversary of philosophy in general, and of cynicism in particular. It is in a dialogue called The Runaways, in which philosophy is speaking. It is an interesting text, and we will come across it twice. I would like to cite it now as one of the many portraits of cynicism which circulated in antiquity. We will come back to it again later for a more precise reason. In this text, philosophy speaks and gives, as it were, its own history and the history of the people who have come to frequent it, or who have tried to take up the principles and rules of philosophical life. In paragraph 12 of The Runaways, it says, "He belongs to that species of contemptible men, for the most part servile and mercenary, who, given over to rough work since childhood, have been unable to form any relationship with me. They are in the grip of slavery, occupied with earning their wages and practicing the trades appropriate to their condition: cobblers, joiners, fullers, and wool carders. Trained in these professions from a very young age, they never heard my name spoken. But when they arrived at manhood, and seeing the multitude showing the deepest respect towards my intimates, that is to say, the true philosophers, tolerating their frankness, seeking their friendship, listening to their advice, and yielding to their slightest reproach, they imagined that philosophy was dominating everyone with its absolute power. To learn what is needed for this profession appeared to them to take too long, or rather to be impossible. On the other hand, their lowly and hard occupations were scarcely enough for their existence, and the yoke of servitude became hard, as it is, in fact. What do? They resolve to drop the final anchor, ride at anchor in the port of madness, call to their aid their usual allies, insolence, ignorance, and impudence, equip themselves with a new provision of insults, which they keep ready at hand. Then they disguise themselves as best they can and put on an appearance similar to my own." This text is interesting for the social landscape. I will come back to this shortly, in which cynicism is placed. There's also the idea here that a certain form of cynicism is only the imitation, caricature, grimace, and imposture of genuine cynicism. In any case, you have a portrait of the crudeness, ignorance, and lack of culture of those who generally practice cynicism. Another extremely harsh and negative portrait of cynicism is found in the Emperor Julian, author of 2 texts directed specifically against cynicism, to the cynic Heraclius and to the uneducated cynics. In paragraph 5 of To the Cynic Heraclius, Julian writes, "Now, in the name of the Muses, answer me this question about cynicism. Is it a form of insanity? A kind of life unworthy of a man? Not to say a brutish tendency of the soul, which denies all beauty, honesty, and goodness? The disappearance of all reverence for the gods, and the discredit of all human prudence leads not only to the laws we identify with honor and justice being trampled underfoot, but even those gods the gods have engraved in our souls, and which we fully believe, without having to be taught that a divine being exists. It is to him that our eyes are turned. Moreover, let us suppose also the rejection of the second, naturally sacred and divine law, which orders total and absolute respect for the rights of others, and which calls on us not to introduce any confusion into this by speech, deeds, or secret impulses of the soul. Does not this attitude deserve the barathrum? Should not those who preach these doctrines be banished without blows of the thyrisi, like expiatory victims, but put to death by stoning? For how do they differ from desert pillagers and coastal bandits who rob those who disembark? They despise death, it is said, as if these bandits were not affected by the same insanity. Here we have an equally violent portrait of the cynics, which this time does not attack the hypocritical imitation of philosophy so much as the fact that the cynics are opposed to divine and human laws and to all the forms of tradition or social organization. These are the 2 major points to which criticism of the cynics are usually attached. But there are many others. Nevertheless, at the same time, and in contrast with this ostentatious, noisy, and aggressive cynicism, which denies the laws, traditions, and rules, even its fiercest adversaries always point out the value and merits of another measured, thoughtful, well-bred, discreet, honest, and really austere cynicism. There is practically no criticism of the cynics which is not accompanied by an explicitly favorable judgment on true cynicism, whether this be an original cynicism which one thinks one can discern, or which one honors in Diogenes or Crates, or an essential cynicism, which is practiced by good cynics, or a principled cynicism, which one practices oneself. For example, Lucian, whose violent opposition to the cynics we have seen, both when directly attacking Peregrinus personally in the text on his death, and when attacking them generally, as in the Runaways, nonetheless gives an extremely positive portrait of a certain Demonax, about whom we know little, except through this long and beautiful portrait of what, according to Lucian, the authentically cynic life would be. On a number of points, this portrait is actually true to some of the general principles of cynicism. Demonax is presented in Lucian's text as a man who was first brought to philosophy naturally by an innate impulse. In fact, one of the important themes of cynicism was that the impulse towards philosophy basically did not require culture, training, or an apprenticeship. One is essentially a philosopher by nature and is born a philosopher. In the obviously mythical dialogue, Dio Chrysostom reports between Diogenes and Alexander. Diogenes explains that king, in the philosophical sense of the word, is not something one becomes. One is king by nature, because one is born a son of Zeus. In this sense, Demonax is also a sort of son of Zeus. He is brought to philosophy naturally by an innate impulse. But Lucian immediately adds, this does not mean that he is not educated. Being led to philosophy by this natural impulse does not entitle him to remain uneducated. On the contrary, he has read a great deal and learned much from the poets. He has familiarized himself with the principles of philosophy and has taken care, furthermore, not to enclose himself in a particular philosophy, but has striven to combine the best elements of different philosophies. Lucian adds that Demonax has completed this literary and philosophical culture with exercises in physical endurance, enabling him to resist deprivation and suffering, physical exercises for the cold and for hunger. In his portrait, Lucian emphasizes another trait which shows that there is indeed a true and good cynicism which even he can recognize. He portrays Demonax, in fact, as a sort of practitioner of the truth, who has been devoted to liberty and parrhesia all his life, and who provides an example of self-knowledge for everyone. But according to Lucian, in Demonax, this concern for the truth does not take the form of violence, aggression, and insult. as it does in so many cynics. As a good physician of human beings who is concerned about the cure of their souls, Demonax practiced mildness and despising all wealth and honor. He strove to take part in the life of the city. The portrait ends by evoking the aging Demonax, close to death. He is welcomed, taken in, supported, and looked after by different Athenian citizens. He is received in different households and gives to each the advice needed or useful for assuring peace and harmony in the family or even in the whole city. A man of truth, to be sure, a man who never feared speaking it. This is evident. Demonax is at the same time someone for whom the practice of truth is a mild, curative, therapeutic practice, a practice of peace, and not of insults and assaults. You see that even Lucian can give a positive portrait and image of cynicism. In a mind much closer to philosophical care, the Emperor Julian, in his discourse to the cynic Heraclius, praises the true cynic philosophy, which he claims to find in Diogenes and Crates, who he sees as the authentic founders of this true cynicism, and whose example is now neglected. Among the principal qualities of Diogenes and Crates, which distinguishes both of them from present-day cynicism, Julian stresses the absence of any distinction, gap, or contradiction between their words and deeds. Here is an example of what Julian writes. So what form did the dealings of our philosophers, Diogenes and Crates, take? Their deeds preceded their words. Those who honored poverty, Diogenes and Crates, demonstrated that they were the first to despise their patrimony, a reference to the fact that Crates gave away all the goods he had inherited from his family. Those who prized modesty, still Diogenes and Crates, were the first to practice simplicity in everything. Those who removed the theatrical pomp and arrogance from others' lives were the first to live on the public squares and in the precincts consecrated to the gods. Before waging a war of words against libertinage, they fought it with their actions and proved by deeds, not by vociferations, that it is possible to reign with Zeus when one has hardly any needs and is not bothered about the body. So there is a true cynicism, the cynicism demonstrated by Crates and Diogenes in words, but above all by their actions. Not only is there this original cynicism to which Julian refers and pays homage, but, and this is interesting, Julian also makes cynicism a sort of universal philosophy which is valid for and accessible to everyone. This is found in the second discourse to the uneducated cynics. This is what he says. As for myself, who would speak with deference of the gods and those who have made their way towards the divine life, I am convinced that even before him, he is referring to Heracles, who, in line with Cynic tradition, he has just made the founder of philosophy, especially ascetic philosophy. There were men, not only among Hellenists, but even among barbarians, who professed this philosophy, the Cynic philosophy, whose core, according to Julian, is found in Crates and Diogenes, in Heracles, and before him. There were men everywhere among Hellenists or barbarians who professed this philosophy, which is, as it seems to me, universal, entirely natural, and demands no special study. It is sufficient to choose what is decent out of desire for virtue and aversion to vice. There is no need to work on thousands of volumes, for it is said, erudition does not give one sense. One does not have to submit oneself to any other discipline than that which the followers of the other various philosophical schools endure. So there is this very interesting representation of cynicism, which is late but very revealing. Cynicism appears here as an ancient philosophy, since it goes back to Heracles, beyond even historically or pseudo-historically identified philosophers like Diogenes and Crates. It goes back to men before Heracles, to all men, Hellenists or barbarians. There is, if you like, cultural universality as well as antiquity. Second, one does not have to undertake any particular or special study to acquire such an ancient and universal philosophy. Very little is required in the way of knowledge. The practice of some ultimately basic virtues, which everyone can know and practice, is enough to form the core of cynicism. The third idea is that this antiquity, universality, and ease of access is at the same time a sort of philosophical syncretism, since to arrive at the cynic modality of existence, it is enough to extract from each of the existing philosophies a basic core related to the practice of the virtues. At this point, cynicism appears as what is universal in philosophy. What is universal, and no doubt also what is banal. But you can see that there is a very strange paradox here, since on the one hand, we have seen cynicism described as a very particular form of life, on the fringe of institutions, laws, and recognized social groups. The cynic is someone truly on the fringes of society, who moves around society itself without being acceptable or taken in. The cynic is driven out. He wanders. And at the same time, cynicism appears as the universal core of philosophy. Cynicism is at the heart of philosophy, and the cynic moves around society without being admitted to it. An interesting paradox. We get the impression that people of the imperial and even late imperial period who were interested in philosophy had a double attitude towards cynicism. On the one hand, there is an attempt to distinguish and eliminate a certain form of cynic practice. And on the other hand, there is an effort to extract from this cynic practice, or from other philosophical practices, some kind of core which was recognized as the essence, the specific, pure essence of cynicism itself. This constantly resumed effort to discriminate between a sham and a true cynicism, between a perverted cynicism and an essential core of cynicism, seems to me quite unusual. Still, there are a number of question marks, for we could find a similar attitude with regard to other philosophies. For example, with regard to the Epicureans, it has become usual to distinguish carefully between the lesson of the first master, Epicurus, and the way in which disciples and corrupt disciples practiced Epicureanism. But with regard to cynicism, it seems to me we are dealing with something a bit different, which appears to be quite unusual in the history of ancient philosophy. It is not just a matter, in fact, of distinguishing between the first lesson, the masters, and then the way in which it is later corrupted and forgotten by the disciples. In the case of cynicism, on the one hand, one seeks to expel the cynic and his mode of existence from the honorable and recognized philosophical field. But, on the other hand, this expulsion cannot be carried out without referring at the same time to a universally valid cynicism, and without claiming to be a cynic oneself or to represent true cynicism. The criticism of cynicism is always made in the name of an essentials criticism, cynicism. You are well aware, of course, that if this kind of procedure is fairly unusual in antiquity, it has often been employed since. After all, you are quite familiar with, or at least have seen, the same phenomenon in recent years with the criticism of socialism, which can only be made in the name of socialism, of an essential socialism. Anyway, there is this form of the development of a quite unusual thought. The third reason why the study of ancient cynicism is difficult and singular is that the cynic tradition contains no or very few theoretical texts. At any rate, we can say that the doctrinal framework of cynicism seems to have been entirely rudimentary. This rudimentary character obviously has to be associated with the popular form of this philosophy. With regard to this link between the rudimentary character of the theory and the popular form of the philosophy, we do not need to speculate about whether this philosophy had to be doctrinally simple because it was popular, or conversely, whether cynicism's theoretical crudity made it a popular philosophy and facilitated its fairly widespread presence in society. In any case, the fact is attested. Cynicism was a philosophy which, on the one hand, had a broad presence in society, and, on the other, had a limited, meager, and elementary theoretical framework. A few words on these two aspects of cynicism. With regard to the first aspect, many accounts test to the popular character of this philosophy. We know that its discourses and interventions were addressed to a wide and consequently not very cultured public. And its recruits came from outside the educated elites who usually practiced philosophy. We know that its discourses and interventions were addressed to a wide and consequently not very cultured public, and its recruits came from outside the educated elites who usually practiced philosophy. You have seen Lucian's account, taken from The Runaways, in which philosophy recounts the birth of cynicism. The people who are said to dedicate themselves to cynicism are described as given over to rough work since childhood, forced to earn their living and practice trades suited to their condition. They were, and Lucian is extremely precise on this point, cobblers, joiners, fullers, and wool carders. And he attributes the interest of these people in philosophy to a sort of political and social ambition. Seeing the respect accorded to the true disciples of true philosophy, seeing how philosophers were welcomed, how their frankness was tolerated, their friendship sought after, and their advice listened to. These people, in reality simple cobblers, joiners, fullers, and wool carders, decided to become philosophers, or rather, to imitate the philosophical kind, the philosophical style of life. This is fairly clear evidence for how the popular character of cynicism was critically perceived. We have another interesting text concerning this popular recruitment and character of cynicism in Dio Chrysostom, Discourse 32. You find a no doubt much more historically reliable description than the one given in Lucian's satire. It is a discourse which Dio Chrysostom addressed to the inhabitants of Alexandria, reproaching them for not listening to the truth, referring to the misfortune of Athens when the Athenians demonstrated their inability to listen to the truths they were told. Dio Chrysostom, 2nd century CE, addressed the inhabitants of Alexandria saying, "You do not listen to the truth." But no doubt a primary reason for you not listening to the truth is that no one tells you this truth. No one tells you the truth. Because those who could or should tell you the truth do not exercise their profession properly. And he distinguishes 3 categories of philosophers, we would say now, more or less. 3 categories of intellectuals. There are intellectuals or philosophers who remain silent. And they remain silent because they think the crowd cannot be convinced, and however much one employs forceful arguments with them and for them, they are never able to understand. Consequently, these philosophers withdraw into themselves and keep quiet. The second category of philosophers are those who keep their remarks for the classroom and lectures for a select public, and who refuse to confront the general public and address themselves to the city as such. There's a third category of philosophers, which this time he names. He does not say who the first 2 categories are. They are the cynics. He describes these cynics posted on street corners, in the lanes, at the doors of the temple, holding out the begging bowl, playing on the credulity of lads, sailors, and people like that, stringing together their crude, farcical remarks. And Dio Chrysostom continues, doing the greatest harm to genuine philosophy by turning the philosopher into a laughing stock. Just as one may ruin teaching by getting children to laugh at their teacher. Here again we have a portrait of cynicism and cynic practice as a popular practice which uses very precise and particular places as its stage. The streets, the doors of the temple, the cynic begs. And who does he address? Who does he convince? What is his public? From whom does he get his support? They are kids, sailors, people like that. Cynicism seems to have been at least to a large degree, a popular philosophy. And to that extent, we can understand its theoretical poverty. But outside of or correlated with this, there was in Cynic doctrine itself a justification of this theoretical poverty, of the thinness and banality of its doctrinal teaching. The two aspects, doctrinal thinness and popular recruitment, refer back to each other through a sort of circular induction. That philosophy not only can, but must have a limited, poor, schematic, doctrinal framework was asserted by the Cynics for a number of reasons which affect the very conception they had of the philosophical life and of the relationship between philosophical teaching and philosophical life. In fact, for the Cynics, the function of philosophical teaching was not essentially to pass on knowledge, but, especially and before all else, to give both an intellectual and moral training to the individuals one formed. It was a matter of arming them for life, so that they were thus able to confront events. Diogenes Laertius gives an example of this conception of teaching as passing on an armature for life, and not a body of knowledge, when he shows how Diogenes the Cynic conceived of the teaching he had to give to the children of Xeniades. Diogenes had been bought as a slave by Xeniades to the latter, who asked him, "I do want to buy you, but what can you do?" Diogenes replied, "I can command." Xeniades reacted to this parrhesiastic answer, saying, "Fine, you will educate my children." Diogenes Laertius recounts the legend of Diogenes' education of Xeniades' children. What did this teaching consist of? The text begins by saying that Diogenes the Cynic had taught Xeniades' children all the sciences. This would seem to indicate an encyclopedic type of education such as could be found in other philosophical schools, in the Platonists or the Peripatetics in particular. But Diogenes Laertius immediately adds, Diogenes had taught Xeniades' children all these sciences in the form of summaries and synopsis, in such a way that they would remember them more easily. That is to say, these sciences are not taught in all their ramifications, but in the essential principles which are necessary and sufficient for living properly. This teaching was completed by an apprenticeship in endurance. Xeniades' children had to be able to wait on themselves, that is to say, without calling on servants and slaves. This is the apprenticeship in independence. He taught them always to wear only simple clothes, without tunic, and without shoes. He also taught them to hunt, no doubt a reference to Spartan teachers, which enables people to manage by themselves, to be independent, to practice autarky. One eats what one catches and kills on the hunt. He also taught them physical posture, a rigorous physical stance. They were not allowed to walk in the street without keeping their eyes lowered and speaking to no one. It is this type of apprenticeship, an apprenticeship in endurance of battle, an apprenticeship in the form of an armature for existence, which characterizes the Cynic teaching. Furthermore, if we are to believe Diogenes Laertius, the Cynics expelled logic and physics from the philosophical domain. They considered morality to be the only genuinely philosophical discipline. They also rejected geometry and music from their teaching. Diogenes Laertius quotes a comment of Diogenes the Cynic replying with these two verses to someone who wanted to teach him music. Men rule their lives and households with wise thought, not with tunes on the lyre and warbling. You can find the theory, or at any rate the development, of this conception of Cynic teaching as training and armature for life in an important text by Seneca. At the beginning of Book 7 of On Benefits, Seneca recounts how Demetrius conceived of learning the sciences. I am sorry, but as the library was closed, I am reading this in a poor translation, but it is not too serious. Demetrius the Cynic, a great man in my view, even when compared with the greatest, was right when he used to say that it is better to know a small number of wise precepts which one has ready to hand for one's use, than to learn many which one does not have at hand. In the same way, a clever wrestler is not one who has learned all the postures and complicated movements which one rarely has to use in fights, but one who, after having carefully practiced one or two of these moves for a long time, watches out for attentively for the opportunity to apply them. For it is not important for him to know a great deal, provided that he know enough to win. Similarly, in this study there are many things which give pleasure, but very few assure victory. The teaching is therefore essentially a teaching of struggle, which must teach what is needed for the struggle and indispensable for gaining victory. On that basis, Demetrius, quoted by Seneca, shows that what is difficult to know in nature is really only hidden because knowledge of it is of no use for life. For example, there is no point in knowing the origin of storms or why there are twins. We do not know these things, and it would be very difficult to know them. They are hidden, since they serve no purpose. On the other hand, all that is necessary to existence, to the struggle which the Cynic life must be, is available to everyone. These are the most familiar and obvious things that nature has set out around us so that we learn them and make use of them. Cynic teaching is simple and practical. It is a teaching which the cynics themselves said was a shortcut, a short way. It is frequently stated that cynic doctrine is a shortcut to virtue, a short way, sunto mos odos. It was so characteristic of cynicism that, in the definition of cynicism given in the Sutta, it is presented as the quick way to virtue. This notion of the quick way to virtue, short-circuiting the lengthy and theoretical teaching, is interesting. In the first place, it is interesting because it is inserted in the long history, which should no doubt be studied, of that figure which appears so frequently in Western philosophical thought, in spirituality, that of the two ways. This figure is found very frequently. We might say that it is a constant. There is the distinction between the two ways. In Parmenides' poem, the first way says that being is, and this is the way of certainty, for it accompanies truth. The other way says what being is not. This way, says Parmenides, is the narrow path on which one can learn nothing. You also find an image of the two ways with a different meaning in the mythical story told by Prodicus in Book 2 of Xenophon's Memorabilia. Prodicus recounted that, at a certain point, Heracles found himself at the parting of two ways, the hard and difficult road of austerity, but which finally leads to true and stable happiness, and the easy road of debauchery and constant pleasures, on which one can never arrive at a stable and definitive happiness, because incessant pleasures disappear, are mixed with suffering, and have to be renewed. This theme of the two ways is frequently found in antiquity, but also in early Christianity. The text called the Didache, which is so characteristic of ancient Christianity, also opens on the distinction between two ways. But these are not the two ways of Parmenides or those of Heracles or Prodicus. They are the way of life and the way of death. The text begins in this way. There are two ways, one of life and the other of death. But the difference between the two ways is great. The Cynics also had a conception of the two ways, but it is not like that of Parmenides or that of Prodicus, or of course the future distinction found in early Christianity. There are two ways, one of which is lengthy, relatively easy, and does not call for great effort, which is the way by which one achieves virtue through the Logos, that is to say, through discourses and learning them, through school and doctrinal apprenticeship. Then there is the other, short way, which is the difficult, arduous way, which rises straight to the summit over many obstacles, and which is, as it were, the silent way. Anyway, it is the way of exercise, of ascesis, of practices and destitution and endurance. Many Cynic texts refer to this distinction of the two ways. Diogenes Laertius alludes to it in the paragraph 104 of his Life of Diogenes the Cynic. There is also a reference in Plutarch's Dialogue on Love, and you find a fairly lengthy description of it in an obviously apocryphal pseudo-letter by Crates. Crates was the first disciple of Diogenes. And in the 1st century CE, a number of apocryphal letters by Diogenes or Crates were circulated. These texts are characteristic, not, of course, of what Crates and Diogenes might have said or thought, but of cynicism as it was recognized, valued, accepted, and circulated at the beginning of the empire. In this pseudo-letter by Crates, letter 21, there is this description of the two ways. Long is the way which leads to happiness through discourse. So, the way of discourse is the long way. The one which goes by daily exercises is a shortcut. But many of those who follow the same aim as the dogs, the Cynic philosophers, flee those who put forward this way when they note how difficult it is. They cannot become dogs by this way. For exercise is naturally much more effective than discourse. Short way, the way of exercise. Long way, the way of discourse. So you can understand how and why the Cynic doctrine is so difficult to pinpoint, to the extent that the passing on of the Cynic life essentially took place through this short way without discourse, which was the way of exercise and apprenticeship. Finally, and related to this moreover, the final reason why the case of cynicism is unusual and its study difficult is that cynicism had a quite particular mode of traditionality. What I mean is this: since, as we have just seen, they are less concerned with teaching a doctrine than with passing on schemas, than to pass on these schemas of life, the Cynics make use not so much of a theoretical, dogmatic teaching as of above all models, stories, anecdotes, and examples. These examples, anecdotes, and stories may be attributed to precise historical figures or founding fathers like Crates and Diogenes, who assuredly existed, but whose historical reality was later overlaid with elements of entirely fictional accounts. So that is very difficult to find the core of their doctrine, or even to entirely legendary and mythical figures like Heracles. So, with this passing on of schemas of life through examples and anecdotes, it is understandable that it is very difficult to know both what Cynic doctrine might have been and also the history of Cynicism and the sequence of historical figures who punctuated it. But through these uncertainties about the history of cynicism and the reality of its doctrine, it seems to me that Cynic teaching, in the way in which it passed itself on through examples and anecdotes, found and gave rise to an interesting and important mode of traditionality. The traditionality of Cynic teaching, which was conveyed through models of behavior, frameworks of attitudes, took the form of brief anecdotes called kraiai, which reported in a few words a gesture, a retort, or an attitude of a cynic in a given situation, or of longer stories, memories, in which a whole episode of the cynic life was recounted, and also jokes and anecdotes, which were called paigna, and which were provoked laughter, and were sorts of comical, ironical kraiai anecdotes. This form of passing on schemas of conduct through exemplary anecdotes found in a traditionality which was very different from what could be called doctrinal traditionality. What does doctrinal traditionality actually consist of? In antiquity, it consisted in reactualizing a forgotten and misunderstood core of thought in order to make it the point of departure and source of authority of a thought which is given in a variable and complex relationship of identity and otherness with the original thought. This traditionality of teaching, this doctrinal traditionality, was obviously very important for passing on philosophical doctrines like Platonism and Aristotelianism, and for Stoicism to a certain extent, already much less so for Epicureanism, and almost not at all for Cynicism. Alongside this, Cynicism, and it should be said, Epicureanism to a certain extent, practiced what could be called not a traditionality of doctrine, but a traditionality of existence. And the traditionality of existence set itself the objective not of reactualizing a core of original thought in the present, but of recalling elements and episodes of lives, of the life of someone who really existed, or of someone who existed mythically, without it really mattering which. Elements and episodes which are now to be imitated, to which life must be given again, not because they have been forgotten, as in doctrinal traditionality, but because now, today, we are no longer equal to these examples, because a decline, an enfeeblement, a decadence have removed the possibility of our doing as much. Let's say schematically that doctrinal traditionality enables a meaning to be maintained or retained beyond forgetfulness. Traditionality of existence, on the other hand, enables the strength of a conduct to be restored beyond a moral enfeeblement. This traditionality of existence, as distinct from the traditionality of doctrine, was undoubtedly important in several philosophical sects, and even in all the philosophical sects to some extent, but the way in which it comes to terms and combines with the traditionality of doctrine is not the same. it is clear that the traditionality of doctrine was the essential part in Platonism or Aristotelianism. And the traditionality of existence, through the passing on of examples of lives, had only a very limited role. In Stoicism and Epicureanism, the combination between traditionality of doctrine and traditionality of existence was more balanced. Either one or the other being a little more important. But in the case of Cynic traditionality, the form of traditionality of existence very largely prevailed, obliterating the traditionality of doctrine almost entirely, or rendering it pointless. And through this traditionality of existence we see emerging, and this is very clear in the Cynics, much more than in any other form of philosophy, much more even than in Epicureanism or Stoicism, that figure which is so important of the philosophical hero. The philosophical hero is different from the sage, from the traditional sage, from the sage of high antiquity, from the sage like Solon or Heraclitus. The philosophical hero is no longer the sage, but he is not yet the Christian holy man or ascetic. Between the sage, the divine man of the archaic tradition, and the ascetic of the last centuries of antiquity, the philosophical hero represents a certain mode of life, which will be extremely important in the period in which it was formed and the model passed on. Inasmuch as this figure of the philosophical hero modeled a number of existences and represented a sort of practical matrix for the philosophical attitude. You see then why cynicism performed this role, which is seen so clearly in Julian as a sort of essence or commonplace of any possible philosophy. Cynicism was precisely the form of philosophical heroism in its most general, rudimentary, and also demanding aspect. Cynicism as the essence of philosophical heroism ran through the whole of antiquity and made it, whatever its theoretical poverty, an important event, not only in the history of forms of life, but in the history of thought. Philosophical heroism, the philosophical life as his heroic life, was something put in place and handed down by this Cynic tradition. So, by informing this image and affirming the values of the philosophical hero, Cynicism had a considerable influence on the development of a Christian asceticism rooted, to a not inconsiderable extent, in this model of heroism. This philosophical heroism formed what could be called a legendary dimension, a philosophical legend which modeled in a particular way how the philosophical life itself has been conceived of and practiced in the West up until now. On the basis of this, we can conceive of the idea of a history of philosophy which would be somewhat different from the history traditionally taught today, a history of philosophy which would not be a history of philosophical doctrines, but a history of forms, modes, and styles of life, a history of the philosophical life as a philosophical problem, but also as a mode of being and as a form both of ethics and heroism. Obviously, this history of philosophy as ethics and heroism would come to a halt when, as you know, philosophy became a teaching profession. That is to say, at the beginning of the 19th century. But even so, we should note that when philosophy becomes a teaching profession, with the result that the philosophical life, philosophical ethics, philosophical heroism, and the philosophical legend no longer have a raison d'etre, the moment when philosophy can no longer be entertained except as an historical set of doctrines is also the moment when the legend of the philosophical life receives its highest and last literary expression. This, of course, Goethe's Faust appears to me to be, it can at any rate be interpreted in this way, the last great image, but also the last great expression of the philosophical legendary as it was formed, developed, and left its deposits over the centuries in our West. Goethe's Faust is that final expression of the philosophical legend. When philosophy becomes a teaching profession, the philosophical life disappears. Unless one were to want to recommence this history of the philosophical life, of philosophical heroism, in exactly the same period, but in a completely different, displaced form. Philosophical heroism, philosophical ethics will no longer find a place in the practice of philosophy as a teaching profession, but in that other displaced and transformed form of philosophical life in the political field, the revolutionary life. Exit Faust and enter the revolutionary. That's it. I have taken a long time. In a moment, we will return to the problem of historical cynicism and the question of the true life in the cynics. And that's the end of the first hour of Lecture 6 of The Courage of Truth. The Courage of the Truth.